By 1995, Nintendo knew CDs were the future. They had seen the storage jump. They had already worked with Sony on the ill-fated CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. They understood exactly where the industry was going. And then they chose not to go with it. When the Nintendo 64 launched in 1996, it used cartridges in a market that was already shifting. Now, that sounds like arrogance or nostalgia or a company that just didn't get it. But that doesn't add up, because Nintendo absolutely understood the trade-off, which means this wasn't a mistake. It was something else. And when you understand what that something else was, you understand how the balance of power in gaming was reshaped for the next 20 years. First, let's eliminate the easy explanation. This wasn't Nintendo being out of touch. By the mid-90s, most PC games were shipping on CD-ROM. Sega had already pushed into CD territory. Sony launched the PlayStation on CD. And the numbers weren't subtle. A CD could hold roughly 650 megabytes. The largest Nintendo 64 cartridges topped out around 64. That's not a small difference. That's an order of magnitude. Nintendo knew that. So if they understood the storage gap and they saw the market moving, why double down on cartridges? Because this wasn't a storage decision, and it wasn't a technical limitation. It was something far more human. Cartridges weren't just media, they were leverage. During the NES and SNES eras, Nintendo manufactured the cartridges themselves. That meant publishers paid up front for production. Nintendo controlled supply and distribution. Minimum orders were enforced. Piracy was harder. Every cartridge printed ran through Nintendo. That wasn't just quality control, that was control. CDs disrupted that model. They were dramatically cheaper, often under $1 per disc, compared to tens of dollars per cartridge, which meant publishers could print more units, take more risks, and absorb fewer losses. With CDs, manufacturing risk dropped, reprints became easier, distribution loosened. Cartridges centralized authority, CDs decentralized it, and Nintendo had built its dominance on central authority. So the real question wasn't whether CDs were better, it was this: what happens to a gatekeeper when the walls start collapsing around the gate? Here's where timing matters. Sony launched the PlayStation worldwide in 1995. By the time the Nintendo 64 arrived in North America in late '96, PlayStation adoption was accelerating. Developers were shipping CD-based games, publishers were adjusting their budgets, consumers were buying into this new model. Nintendo wasn't entering an open battlefield. They were stepping onto one that was already shifting. And they weren't bringing the format most of the industry was building around. That's not a small gamble. That's betting your authority against market momentum. But when momentum builds, it doesn't stop to ask authority for approval. Now, to be fair, authority wasn't defending something useless. Cartridges did have advantages: virtually no load times, greater durability, stronger piracy resistance. And if you grew up with them, there was something oddly satisfying about plugging one in. But from a publisher's perspective, cartridges meant higher manufacturing costs, larger upfront commitments, and far greater financial risk. Meanwhile, CDs were cheaper, easier to reproduce, and far less punishing if a game didn't sell. That difference changes behavior. Games were also becoming more cinematic, voice-acted, larger in scope, experimenting with full-motion video, orchestral soundtracks, expansive 3D worlds. CDs didn't just hold more data, they lowered the cost of risk. Sony leaned into that risk. The original PlayStation would eventually sell over 100 million units worldwide, more than 3 times the Nintendo 64's lifetime total. That gap isn't just about hardware, it's about which ecosystem made growth easier. And when risk becomes cheaper, more people are willing to take it. So when a few early bets paid off, the rest of the industry paid attention. It wasn't one dramatic betrayal, it was a drift. Publisher by publisher, project by project. As CDs lowered risk and expanded scope, more developers started choosing PlayStation, not out of loyalty, not out of rebellion, but because the math made sense. Media costs were lower, financial exposure was reduced, creative experiments were easier to justify, and once a few major publishers shifted, others watched and adjusted. By the time it felt obvious that momentum had moved, it wasn't a surprise. It was reality. Once developers stop building around you, you lose the authority to set the terms. In hindsight, we can't help but ask, how did Nintendo allow this to happen? Nintendo understood what CDs meant. They saw the storage gap, they saw the cost difference, they saw developers experimenting in new directions. They weren't confused. They weren't technologically behind. They were protecting something. Switching to CDs in 1996 wouldn't have just been a hardware update. It would have meant dismantling the system that gave them leverage, the system that kept publishers dependent, the system that kept authority centralized. That's not a small adjustment. That's a philosophical shift. And philosophical shifts are harder than technological ones, because technology changes quickly. Power structures do not. And sometimes what makes you powerful eventually becomes the very thing that starts to hold you back. Because of that one decision, the Nintendo 64 didn't just lose a generation, it marked a shift. After that, third-party developers stopped building around Nintendo first. The GameCube used proprietary mini-discs. Third-party hesitancy continued. Nintendo leaned harder into first-party strength, and eventually with the Wii, they stepped away from the graphical arms race entirely. Not because they couldn't compete, but because they realized it was time to redefine their approach to the battlefield. That pivot didn't happen in isolation. It traces back to 1996, to the moment they decided protecting control mattered more than expanding with the market. And from that point forward, the industry no longer moved with Nintendo at its center. So no, Nintendo didn't misunderstand the future. They saw it. They understood what CDs meant. They understood what publishers wanted. They understood where the industry was expanding. But embracing that expansion would have meant dismantling the system that made their rise to dominance possible. So they chose control. Not because they were blind, because they believed the system they built could still hold. The Nintendo 64 wasn't a technological mistake. It was a line in the sand. And when Nintendo drew it, the industry stepped over it. So what do you think? If you were in Nintendo's position in 1996, would you have protected control or chased expansion? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and happy gaming, my friends.